Hey, it's Amethyst Virgo. I'm here with this rising sign video. Okay, so the reason is, I want to really differentiate between the sun and the rising. And this is helpful for some of us that need a refresher. This is helpful for some of us that have to explain this to other people. This can also be helpful for people who are new to astrology, who are like, wait, these sound kind of similar. Can you let me know how they're different? Now, what I first want to do is I'm going to break this down in the way that it makes sense to me, in the way I explain to clients. Also, keep in mind that I have two other videos about the rising. Now, the first one, I'm going to be honest with you. The first one is like foundational Amethyst Virgo. It's like maybe 3 years old. The first rising sign video is not the greatest. But my last one, the one before this, is really good. That one is, I go through all of the signs. I go through the rising signs. I explain all of those different things. I talk about what the rising is, and then I go through the signs. So check that out if you're interested. So let's get the language cleared up. You'll hear rising versus ascendant. Now, technically, the more formal way to describe it is the ascendant is what's sitting on the first house cusp point, right? So when we're discussing that particular placement, it is the ascendant. That is why when you look at aspects, you're never going to see moon square rising, or you're never going to see, Mercury trine rising. You're going to see Mercury trine ascendant, moon square ascendant. You're going to see the word ascendant. So it's important to get that in your vocabulary when you are doing aspects or anything of that nature. When we're talking about the actual points. The importance of saying ascendant sometimes is also, remember, the descendant signs of the 7th house cusp. So first house and 7th house cusps are important, as are the 4th and the 10th house cusp signs. We know that. Now, the rising, when you hear rising interchangeably, it is the same sign, right? It's not, if you're a Virgo ascendant, you're Virgo rising. If you're a Gemini ascendant, you're Gemini rising. So that is not a point of contention. But it really is signifying what sign was rising over the eastern horizon when you were born. So that's why the rising sign is typically just a little bit easier, rolls a little bit off the tongue, maybe a little bit better. All right? So you'll hear people say, I'm a Scorpio rising, I'm a Gemini rising, I'm a Capricorn rising, I'm a Cancer rising, or whatever it is that you are. So now, little tidbit. Now, what you may notice, and I've noticed this, and I don't know if some of you have, one thing I notice a lot is I attract a lot of Virgo rising clients. So I'm a Virgo sun, and I attract a fair amount of Virgo suns as well. But it's interesting that I attract people of all kind of sun signs, but a lot of Virgo rising people. Now, what's interesting there is you may instantly recognize that you share similar default traits as those sharing the sun sign, right? Thinking about somebody I know right now that I work with that's a Virgo, we are both the first people at work a lot of times. It was funny, like one summer, it was almost like, it wasn't a real competition, but it'd be like, it was either me or you are going to be, here early. We share that. Virgos always got so much going on through our minds that we have to show up early to get everything done. Because guess what? Things could go wrong. So Virgos, sometimes y'all have to understand, like, people who aren't Virgos, like, that's what's going on in our minds. We know that anything could go wrong at any time. We want to prepare for that by being overly prepared so we can deal with whatever nonsense is about to go down. Now, but you may feel you have more similar life experiences with people with your same rising sign. And that is because you're going to have similar cusp signs. Especially if we use whole signs. If we only want to go through whole signs, somebody with the same rising as you is going to have the same exact signs on the cusp. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to have planets. You both could have Scorpio on the 3rd house cusp, but you have you have a planet and the North Node there, and that person doesn't have any planets there, but Scorpio is still there. You get what I'm saying? So if when your rising sign matches with someone else, there's more likelihood of it being similar. Now, Placidus, we know, gets a little dicey because with Placidus, now we're dealing more specifically even with house degrees, right? And with Placidus, we can see a person who's a late degree Scorpio who actually has a transit chart, or their chart is set up a little bit more where the energy starts to shift a little bit more, and they, almost like a Sag, right? So we do understand that Placidus makes it a little bit different for us to guess what someone has on the cusp, because we can have interceptions, we can have all types of stuff. But for all intents and purposes, what I've noticed with people's charts, even with using Placidus, people with the same rising sign are eventually going to match up. So I know 2 Virgo risings, thinking of them right now. I personally know them. They're not the same sign. They're not the same sun sign as me either, but we are Virgo risings. But even though our charts vary a little bit, our signs are similar in certain placements at cusp. So let's move on. Question. So some questions people may ask is the sun or the rising? What is more important? How does this play a role in who I am? Is the sun who I am? Is the rising who I am? Like, what does that all mean? I will say this. The rising will play an integral role due to its presence on the first house cusp. The way I like to explain it to people, because sometimes people are like, well, what does that have to do with how I'm seen? What does that have to do with how people look at me or perceive me? Remember, Mars is your action, or there's an instinctual level to the first house. There's a need to be. There's a need to kind of break free bonds of, like, think of the 12th house where things are hidden, and the first house is this energy of this raw potential of being, right? And so with that said, it's more instinctual energy and not as conscious as the sun. Now, the conscious identity, think of the sun, who we know we are. I know I'm this. Right? Consider this the ego. You're familiar with the ego is superego, right? The sun is the conscious identity. I know what traits I'm comfortable showing. I know who I am. Forget a sun sign for a second. Your identity. You know what you identify as. You know who you are. I don't have to think too much about it. I know what I am. It's a core essence of who I am, right? Instinctual identity, the part of your identity is formed through the experiences in life. I'm responding to life. We are responding to life. That is another part of the rising. And whatever we respond to sometimes can be things we did not choose. Talk a lot of times to the Scorpio risings that feel very heavy. That some Scorpio risings can feel like, it feels like life is always putting things that you have to respond and react to. And there's been maybe a lot of emotional upheaval in some Scorpio risings' lives. Now we respond or react to experiences painting our rising. We're coloring in our rising, right? That's a way to look at it. It's a little bit more instinctual than the sun. The sun, I'm comfortable with this. I don't have to think about being a Virgo. I don't have to think about Virgo traits. It just is what it is. Now, I'm going to move on to Mars because I want us also not to get wrapped up in like, wait a minute, Mars is the first house. It is. Mars is still the planet. Mars is still our action, our instinct, our aggression, our dominance, leadership, activity. The instinct to act is Mars. I'm clear, okay, Mars and Leo. If I have something to do, it's probably going to be done in the Mars and Leo way, right? Whereas if I'm thinking about the Virgo rising, instinctually, that's how I'm moving through life. Every area of my life in a way. Think of it like this. I tell my clients. The chart ruler, in my opinion, it impacts every house in your chart. Even if it has no, you look at that and you're like, wait, Jupiter? Yes, if your Jupiter's your chart ruler, it's going to in some way impact every area of your house, of your chart in some way. Okay, so let's move on here. So what we're going to move on to is understand that consider Mars a superego. So some questions that might come up sometimes that people might ask is like, wait, what's more important, the sun or the rising? I'll get to that in the next slide, right? But these are some of the common questions. Some people are like, I want to claim my rising because it's more interesting to me than my sun. Should I do that? Some people like that. Imagine being like me. So I'm a Virgo, obviously. I'm a Virgo sun, Virgo rising. Imagine me when I first stumbled upon a birth chart, plugged my information in, and I was like, ooh, what's my rising? And it's like Virgo. Womp womp, right? No, it's cool. It helps me see things, in the way in which it's cohesive. My sun and my ascendant, they actually are conjunct. They're 1 degree and 3 degrees, so they're close. And when you do degree work, you start to see that there's a difference between a 1 degree and a 3rd degree, right? So there's ways to differentiate that. Anyway, the rising will play an integral role due to its presence on the first house cusp. It is more instinctual energy, I would say, than the sun. The sun is who I am. I know this. I don't have to think about it. I'm clear. The sun is more what you're trying to shed a light on in life, right? It's almost like you walk into a situation, you walk into something, and the sun is going to be the traits and the way in which you illuminate and remind us. Virgo is going to remind us the importance of those Virgo traits. Doesn't mean the Virgo is preaching about being a Virgo. Doesn't mean the Sag is preaching about being a Sag. The Sag is going to be the one in the conversation reminding us, hey, have you thought about these people though too? Like, that's not cool. That's not fair. We need to do it like, why haven't we done it like this, right? Your sun traits are going to help us remind. It's the Libra. It's the Libra sun who's like, oh, what do you think about this? The Libra reminds us, hey, I care about your opinion too. See what I'm saying? That's our sun. That's more the conscious identity. Let's consider the ego. You're familiar with the ego, id, and superego. Let's consider the conscious identity. I am the sun. I know what I am. I'm projecting this. Now, whether your sun has aspects, there are people that have squares to their sun, and there are people who have a lot of squares to their sun. Like, there could be people who have like some energy being blocked, where the sun is not functioning to the way in which they feel confident. But let's just use this in a general way. And I would say the rising, in my opinion, the way I want to word it, is instinctual identity. It is more of this aware inside or internal drive that we have. And it's, you know, you could say that's kind of like the moon is the internal drive. But I feel like with the rising sign, it's our response. It's our reaction to life. The moon is what we're feeling inside. And sometimes those things come out. But the rising captures the things we did not choose. Sometimes we do have to respond to certain things in life. And I talk a lot to my Scorpio risings. I feel like a lot of Scorpio risings have situations where they're always responding to something heavy or intense. And sometimes these are things that are not of their own doing, right? But that's just the way in which life kind of goes for them. So it's almost like it leads into almost every single area of your life in a way. Okay, so this is more responsive or reactive. Now, what about Mars? So you might say, wait a minute. So, but Mars rules the first house, and Mars is associated with the first house. So what role does this play? I do think it's important for us to understand when we're looking at the angles, the 1st, the 4th, the 7th, the 10th, of what planet rules that house. Mars rules this house, we know, so we are dealing with this level of action. This is why I think it's important for us to look at the rising sign through also our action. Looking at it also through, you know, people are like, well, how am I perceived like my rising sign? Because people see you doing your rising sign. They see you kind of, your approach to life is that rising in a way. Okay. Now, Mars represents our action, aggression, sexual prowess, dominance, leadership, physical activity. So with Mars, that is more of, you know, the Mars is this energy of the superego, right? Let's consider it like that. For those of you that are familiar, that might be a little bit of a stretch, but that's how we would differentiate between the sun, the rising, and Mars. They all can blend together. Some of you might have aspects with all three, doing certain things with each other. But we have to also understand the fact that the rising sign can also be this experience that we have through life. It is more thematic. Let's say that. Your rising is more thematic. Get what I'm saying? So let's move on to another note. Rising sign. The sun is the conscious self, one, right? We know that. It differs from the rising, which is our instinctive reaction. We strive for our rising in a way, okay? It is an impetus. Think of it as an impetus, okay? When, you know, the way in which you are leading through or approaching life. And I have a few examples for anyone who's like, I still don't get it. Now, first house is a body of action of self. It is not consciousness, okay? You have first house energy asserting, this is who I am. This is what I am. The first house is kind of landing your feet somewhere and saying, I exist. That is why we have to look at the rising in that way. Now, let me give this example. Before I know you, I know what you're doing. I can look down the street right now and probably see somebody. I don't know anything about that person, but I see what they're doing. And if I see what they're doing, I get a perception about them, okay? So the example I have is I see the red car miles away. I can't see what make or model it is, but that driver drives really fast. I have an impression about that driver. So before that driver even comes to me, before I even judge what make or model that car is, I notice that. Okay. Now remember, perception is a part of reality. Perception is a part of life. Yes, there are people whose identities have been formed by how they have been treated. That is real. If someone has a Virgo rising, for example, they are compelled to act with Mercury in mind. You'll see them analyze, overperform, and care about presentation. This is where you can see someone whose sun sign traits are very clear, but they might hesitate sometimes to do certain things. Have you ever met like a fire sign person whose personality rings very fire, but when it comes time to their approach to life, they're more cautious? That is the imprint of the Virgo, of the rising, right? Virgo rising is the example I'm giving in this case, but it could be any rising, right? It's the imprint there, okay? Now, is it more important than your sun, the rising? Now, some traditional modes of astrology said yes. I read a book one time and it said they used to ask, what is your sign? But it meant your rising. Now, sun sign astrology was easier to simplify because of the sun cycle. If I can say everybody born between these dates has these things going on in their life, that was easier. But that was not always how astrology, that was not the way astrology was intended to be, okay? Now, we're not going to say that horoscopes are completely useless, but as you know, the most useful horoscope is going to be a transit reading, right? With your birth chart information. It was popularized by R.H. Naylor in 1937. He popularized the kind of sun sign astrology that was easier, was more lighthearted, and it simplified this process, right? And obviously throughout the generations, we kind of lost that. Well, not every culture, but we lost that until like we started to see like, oh wow, people now know their moon sign, right? People did not. I know way more people who aren't even astrologers into astrology hardcore that know their rising, know their moon sign. Whereas I could say about 10 years ago, I wouldn't say that was the case. Now, the importance is going to depend on the individual. More aspects to the ascendant than the sun. Like one person I did a reading for, they had their sun in a sign, but there really weren't a ton of, like there were some aspects of the sun for sure. There's always going to be aspects of the sun in people's charts for the most part. Yes, because you know, but they had a lot more going on with their ascendant sign, right? So that is possible. The person may feel like they're responding to life and circumstances around them a lot. The more you have aspects to your ascendant, the more there's life themes and things that you have to feel like you're doing, you're responding to, you're reacting to. Whereas the sun, if a person has more aspects of the sun than the ascendant, the person tends to have themes around self-expression. Now, rising is said to give physical traits. I think physical traits in astrology are extremely fascinating. I do think it's valid. Personally, though, I think it will depend on other factors and aspects to the ascendant, okay? Because I've seen people look very much like their sun sign, but like some people say, well, no, their rising is what they're going to look like. But that's not always been the case in my experience. So I do think when you're talking about physical appearance, to be more sure, you have to really look at the aspects to sun and ascendant. Like really see what's going on there to really see what the person may look more like. But that's a whole different conversation. Let's give an example. So here's the thing. Some of us have our sun and rising in the same sign. That's easier to pinpoint people. I've definitely pinpointed someone before and I'm like, that's a Gemini sun, that's a Gemini rising too. They were very, very Gemini. And the same thing with an Aquarius I knew. This Aquarius was very Aquarius. And I was right in both cases. Now, if you have your sun and rising in the same sign, it can feel easy at first. But there are some differences that you can still do. Now, I'm just using Virgo as an example just to keep this easy, clean, and just share with you an example of my own. And you can kind of marry it to whatever you've experienced. For example, I have Sun in Virgo in the 12th house at the 1st degree. 12th house, I'm very introspective. The sun is hidden. I'm confident doing things on my own. I'm introspective. I'm reflective. I already know if something isn't right or to my liking, and I know how to get it done behind the scenes. I don't really need a lot of people to tell me how to do it. And the 1st degree is also going to be, remember, I use Nicola Stanjovic's degree system. The 1st degree is that Aries energy, that very independent spirit of I know how to do this on my own. I'm just going to get this done on my own. Like, I already know if I made a mistake, usually, not all the time, but if I made a mistake and it's something more clear, I already know I have to go fix that, so I typically will do it. I don't have to wait for someone to say, especially at my career, my job. Virgo at the 3rd degree rising is going to be a little bit different, right? So again, my sun energy, I'm really aware of that. Even though the sun is in the 12th house, I get it, right? I get it. I get the 12th house energy, the hidden, the behind the scenes, the the person who can sometimes just do things in a way that is more isolated, but not because I'm trying to always isolate, but I just sometimes like to get things done myself. Like, I know how to get it done. I don't need to wait for you, right? Type of energy. Now, obviously in my career, I can't always operate like that. I have to work with people and collaborate, but at the 1st degree, Virgo energy tends to have more of even more so, an independent spirit, just getting something done. You can tend to see a Virgo who is less worried about what other people are going to think. If you have that 1st degree Virgo, like it's more about like, I'm going to do this and I trust in myself to get this done. Now, at the 3rd degree, my rising, for example, and again, this is not me trying to just talk about myself. I'm just giving you an example that I know very well. So what people will see of me or describe of me is, oh, you're studious, or you're very informative, or people have sometimes said, oh, you're very calm. But then when they get to talk to me, they notice, oh, you're really cool to talk to. Well, that 3rd degree, right? But also my Mercury's in Leo. Now, it is in the 12th house, which means I'm not a very ostentatious person. If my Mercury's in Leo in the 5th house, you probably see a different thing. But Mercury and Leo people, we're always waiting to tell people what we know, right? So if you get a person in the conversation, we're going to talk. We're going to talk about what we know. Okay. Now, because Virgo is analytical, what you're gonna get there is someone who is eager to talk about processes of things. The conversation just keeps going and going. But with Virgo rising sense of consciousness, self-conscious energy sometimes, Virgo rising, I know that I'm very aware when I'm talking too much. And I really don't tend to overtalk people. But I know how to listen and I know how to say. So even though I have that you could say that 3rd degree, that Gemini, remember I use Nicola Stanjovic's degree system. Other astrologies might use other degree systems. I use what works for me and my clients, and it has, ever since I've used it, it has made chart interpretation so seamless. Now, there are different degree systems you should use if you're doing different types of astrology. If you are doing, like I know sometimes in Vedic, there are certain degrees that are significant. I know in horary astrology, you might want to pay really close attention to that 29th degree. Also in forensic astrology, you want to pay attention to those critical degrees that are outlined in that type of astrology. But for natal charts, this is what I like to do. Okay, and transits as well. So the point I'm making here is that the Virgo rising realizes, right? I'm going to realize I'm not going to dominate this conversation. There's a polite energy to some Virgos, right? So I know that some of y'all have bad experience with some Virgos, but some Virgos, there's a polite energy. And again, if the sun's in the 12th house, this is not a really egotistical person in the first place. However, that Mercury in Leo, that Mars in Leo, that can produce a person who does have some pride. So you can't assume, oh, this person I can push over them, because then you get that Leo lion come out. And that just happens in my case. But the real thing I wanted to show you is that if you have your sun and rising in the same sign and you're like me and you're like, dang, this isn't that interesting. It is. Look at the degrees to see the different influences of your sun versus your rising. Now, let me give an example of 2 different signs. Okay. So I'm sorry, I don't know why this came out pink. If it really hurts your eyes, just listen to me. This is going to be quick. I'm almost done. The Capricorn Sun and Aries Ascendant. So let's say this person, and we know we can interchangeably say rising and ascendant. Early on in the video, I talked about the different ways in which you would use one term over the other. Same thing though. So let's get it. So these are both signs that are cardinal. So this is a very active person. I'm going to assume this would be a very independent, active, but also someone who wants to achieve. This is a person who sometimes can take more risks than the average Capricorn. But understanding Capricorn Sun energy is confidence when achieving. Now, I want to be clear that I think sometimes we can narrow down Capricorn as like, oh, they're just working at a goal. They're just grinding all day. That's all they're doing. Capricorn is doing things in a way that are going to produce a long-term result. And sometimes Capricorn has more self-restraint, being ruled by Saturn, or they can appear that way. Some of them appear that they have it, but they may not always. But there's a self-restraint there. There is a layer of caution. There is a layer of practical energy. There is, what I like about Capricorn sometimes is Capricorn is not going to put energy into something that does not matter, something that is not going to lead into something. That's one thing, the benefit of Capricorn. So we want to look at it like in any area of their life. If it's a project, if it's a relationship, if it's work, if it's family. Capricorn does tend to have a more traditional approach, a loyalty to tradition, even if the person doesn't seem it at first. But with that said, if they have an Aries rising, they're more active. They're spontaneous. They're the person when they go out to an event and someone says, I need a volunteer from the audience. That Aries Ascendant person is going straight up. They're the first one up. So sometimes you can see those type of energies. Now, what you have to understand about a Capricorn Sun, Aries Ascendant, again, this is just me talking about these 2 placements. I'm not interpreting your chart right now, or your brother, your boyfriend, or your sister. I'm talking about if I were just to look at these 2 placements. The person, they're never going to do something that does not in some way make them feel comfortable. If they're volunteering to go out on stage and do something, it's because they want to prove something to themselves. Remember, the energy that a Capricorn Sun is exerting. They're showing and reminding us, hey, there's a process to stuff. Hey, if we're doing something, it should be for a reason. Hey, they are courageous when it comes to literal goals if you have a Capricorn Sun, Aries Ascendant. Okay? So what that would mean is one day, let's say you're like, okay, this is my friend. Sorry for the noise, the cat. You're like, wow, yeah, like I've just met this person. I know him for about 6 months. They're really cool. They're down to do whatever. They're really responsible. You know, this is a person that's making waves in the world, right? And you respect this person. You feel like they have a lot of integrity. Capricorn can sometimes have that integrity piece. Sometimes to a fault, right? To a fault being too, and not to say that integrity is bad, but sometimes it's like Capricorn is so attached to something long term that it's difficult to kind of change gears when needed, right? You know, especially if power is involved. But let's say one day you call them to a random hike in the woods and you say, my friend is gonna come with me, why not? And they're like, no, I don't want to do that. And you're like, wait, you just volunteered to do this thing at work. Or wait, you know, we just did something else the other week. Like, what's going on? When I called you up to randomly go on a vacation, you went with me. Well, that might be that person knew why they wanted to do it. That Capricorn Sun person might say, I have a goal of going to 20 countries before I reach the age of 30. And that Capricorn Sun went with you. That Capricorn Sun, Aries Ascendant person went with you because they were like, wait, if I go with you, I'm going to achieve some of my goals. So it's not the same cautious Capricorn energy that you would see if a Capricorn Sun or a Capricorn Rising that might have said like, no, let me think about that. That's not really part of my plan. I already, you know, have an idea of what I want to do, right? Especially, let's say if you have a Capricorn Sun, Virgo, Moon type of person, right? They already know what they want to do. They already planned it out. So like, no, I mean, you telling me about this trip is really not ideal for me right now. You're imposing on my time. And Capricorn doesn't like people to impose on their time. Even when Capricorn might take a long time to do something, they typically don't like for you to. You know, they like to know how you're part of their plan. And I don't want to make it sound like a calculated thing because sometimes it could be a warm Capricorn energy where it's literally a Capricorn just needs to know in order for them to see how you fit into the bigger picture. And it's someone who has pretty good, you know, mannerisms, but they're kind of like, look, I need to know if you want to be in a relationship with me or not. I know what my goals are. I don't want to waste time. And that could be a very Capricorn type of thing to say. You know, I don't want to waste time. I know what I want. I know what my goals are. And they kind of might confront a partner who they think is not as invested. So the example of you thinking that your Capricorn Sun, Aries rising person is going to just jump to the challenge or jump to whatever you want them to do, we have to understand that Capricorn knows itself what to dedicate its time to. So if you ask them to go to a random hike in the woods and you're like, oh yeah, this is my friend, they're going to be down, they might say no, they might say yes. But in this example, I'm saying the reason why a Capricorn Sun, Aries rising person may decline, you know, it could be it's not a part of their bigger picture. If you're randomly springing something on them that day that takes them away from a bigger goal or something they're working on or something they've been anticipating to do, that is why you might get that no. So that's what we have to understand when we are doing interpretation. We're understanding the Sun and the Ascendant, and we're understanding the different modality in the ways in which they both present. And what way are we going to see someone's primary instinctual traits versus how are we going to see someone's traits that they consciously choose to embody, which is through the Sun.